Welcome to The Bone, the podcast that goes deeper. Here we cut through the noise and get straight to the core of the issues that matter. From real stories to raw truths, we dive deep into the conversations that shape our world and challenge our thinking. We're not afraid to dig in and get to the marrow of it all. Whether it's life, culture, or business in sports medicine, we're here to break it down raw and real. No filters, no fluff, just to the bone. With your host, Shelby Daly, we're getting to the bone. This is a clinically pressed, approved CEU podcast. Find the quiz to gain credit at clinicallypressed.org/courses. Clinically Pressed Company, making the complicated simple through results that give back. Find out more at clinicallypressed.org. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bone. Today we have Lindsey Eberman, athletic trainer. She is currently in Indiana at Indiana State. She's a professor and program director of athletic training for the post-professional doctorate program. We both went to FIU, but she spent a little bit more time doing her master's and her doctorate. Currently, she's also the editor-in-chief of Clinical Practice Athletic Training, over 200 published manuscripts, over 200 published abstracts associated with hundreds of peer-reviewed articles, and invited presentations, and a few book chapters to add to the list. Her research agenda focused on athletic training education, specifically clinical education, post-professional education, and continuing professional development. She fosters clinical expertise and advanced practice leadership skills in the graduates of the Doctorate in Athletic Training program. So, with all that expertise, we're going to talk about athletic training education. But before we head off, what is your favorite thing to do as an athletic trainer?
My favorite thing to do, I think it's interacting with people, and I think that comes when I think about, like, why do I want to be an athletic trainer? What's my favorite thing about athletic training? I think about how some of the coolest people I've ever met are athletic trainers, and how our profession draws a certain kind of human that is interested in problem solving and helping other people. And those skills are really transferable in any environment, which makes athletic trainers pretty awesome people to spend time with. And then when I think about it from a clinical practice perspective, like, the most important thing to me is patient-centered care and making sure people have an inclusive space to interact with healthcare. And so I think that interaction with people and being an empathetic listener and hearing about their story is probably my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, we are definitely a unique group of people. So as we roll into learning about the education, I was wondering, could you give us a brief history of the development and the structure of the current athletic training education program?
Sure. If we want to go all the way back, Indiana State actually has one of the oldest athletic training programs in the country. So our first bachelor's degree program opened in 1969. And then the first master's degree program in 1972. And way back then, essentially undergrad and grad, or bachelor's and master's, were both professional entry type degrees. There was not a substantive curriculum. There was a heavy emphasis on clinical education and kind of practicum or internship or apprenticeship type of learning, which originates from medical training, the turn of 18th to 19th century, very similar in that you spend time with people who are doing the job, and that's how you kind of learn how to do the job. And so when the first program evolved, there was the introduction of actual formal coursework. And although I think it wouldn't look anything like what it looks like today, it provided an introduction to the profession and an appreciation for anatomy and orthopedics from that broader sense, and emergency management in many ways. And there was a strong connection between college athletics and athletic training. So as we progressed as a profession, the expectations around teaching and learning, and how somebody develops as a healthcare provider in the broader healthcare education context evolved and changed, and so did athletic training. So a lot of the evolutions in athletic training education come years, sometimes decades, after other healthcare professions kind of evolve the expectations around education and what prepares somebody. So as athletic training progressed, right around 2003, we went from a space where somebody could train in that kind of like practicum environment. So somebody could take the exam if they had spent time with people doing athletic training, and then which would have been referred to as the internship route. And then for folks who did curriculum programs, both of those populations would have been eligible to take the certifying exam. And so that was kind of one of the pivotal moments in the educational progression. And it was pretty rocky, just as much as some folks might say the transition to the master's degree was relatively rocky. I was an undergraduate student and went to school at a place where the faculty were actually chair of the education committee. And that's what was back in the day when the structure all came from the NATA. That kind of education committee was the one making decisions around how people were educated. And it was pretty rocky in terms of how people were receiving that information as athletic trainers. And so, fast forward to the last several years where the transition or expectation to deliver the program at the master's degree level occurred. And then the implementation of the new accreditation standards that have the curricular content actually tied in them, which is a fundamental difference than how we were doing things in the past. And that piece has raised the expectation around how we talk about teaching and learning in athletic training. So if we think about the curricular content standards from the CATE, they're essentially written as learning outcomes. So the expectation is that the learner is able to do blank, and that's the curricular content standard. And so that helped to, I think, as an educator, better define what the expectations are of the program in terms of making sure learners are prepared to engage in clinical practice that leads to clinicians that can practice at the top of their license in every state. So the kind of pivot points are like really kind of inflection points in our profession, obviously, or the emergence of actual formal education, the emergence of the BOC exam, and then the transition out of internship expectation into curricular programs, and then the expectation for the degree to be offered at the master's level. And I think just, side commentary, like my perception, I think that the expectation to move to the master's degree is one that helps us to be better situated in the American healthcare system. And it also came at what I would consider the perfect storm in terms of an enrollment cliff in higher education, the decrease in the number of people actually entering college as a freshman, the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on broader higher education, and also on practice of athletic training, and then the degree transition happening almost all simultaneously in the same 5 to 6 year period has created, I think, increased tension around the degree transition.
Yeah. Well, and if we've already gone through this degree transition once, I'm not sure why everybody's hair's on fire. We've already done it once. We should know it turns out okay.
And we should imagine, why would we consider staying the same 2 decades later? What does that say about us as a healthcare profession if we can't see how we should be evolving with other healthcare professions education? And if we think about CATE as the accreditor of athletic training programs, they also answer to an accreditor who accredits programs in terms of health professions education. And so we're answering to the call from our accreditor as well, from if we think about folks in athletic training education answering to the CAT, and then the CAT answering to JIA.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think CAT is the top, and nowhere else it goes.
Even if we think about it, this is a perfect timing. The president of the United States, some people think that's the top, but they answer to the people, right? And so it's all cyclical.
Yeah. So with that evolution, we've obviously added different roles, and some are coming and going, but the fellowship, the residency, the graduate assistant, and then credentialing. Can you talk about those different areas and why each one is special?
Sure. I mean, I think if we take a step back a little bit, I think one of the goals of, go back and look at the future directions of athletic training education that happened around, I believe it was 2011. The concept of having students complete an athletic training degree at the master's level, one of the reasons was making sure there was sufficient curricular space for a program to actually teach all that curricular content. So if I'm thinking about delivering a program at a bachelor's degree level, I work in a state in Indiana where our degree programs are capped at 120 credits. So I have to compete with general education. The idea that somebody should be able to come to athletic training, even if they started down a different path or were interested in something else, that it doesn't add time to their degree, that they could still come to our program, and then the curricular content that I have to teach. And so that was really constraining from a program delivery standpoint at the bachelor's degree. So when we think about it from the master's degree, all the curricular content, like all of the curriculum, should be focused on, or broadly should be focused on, athletic training. It may have components of things like interprofessional and collaborative practice, but again, you can tie that back to the curricular content. But the idea was that would actually give us better time and space and focused effort to prepare the athletic trainer, that they didn't need some of these former transition of practice experiences like graduate assistantships and internships that folks were doing. The reality is we probably are better preparing them. That may not be true across the board, right? Programs were able to transition their degree program before they had to meet the new standards. So we're starting to see some of those programs have to really elevate what they offered, that maybe when we asked them to do a substantive change, that they actually substantively changed their degree. And then that they were preparing people so that they didn't need some of those transitional practice experiences. So that's where some of the concepts around progressive autonomous experiences. So learners should be engaged in clinical experiences where they're elevating themselves as they progress through the program. And so a lot of these expectations within the 2020 standards are there to help bring somebody to a place where they should be able to engage in autonomous practice upon graduation without some of these additional transition or practice experiences. In my experience and my observation is that unfortunately their mentors didn't have that experience. And so when they ask their mentors, should I do a residency, or should I do a fellowship, or should I do a DAT, they're getting advice that suggests that maybe they shouldn't do those things and that they should do an internship or a poorly paid internship, because that's how you progress in traditional professional sports and traditional college athletics, is experience over preparation, formal education preparation, or formal programming. And so I think there's a disconnect between post-professional learning experiences that are available and the mentorship and advice that folks are getting from preceptors and mentors, because there was a different experience for those folks. So those folks didn't have those experiences, so they can't really speak to them.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the different roles of degree programs and residency and fellowship and specialty credentialing, from the perspective of, and let's say the ideal athletic training education outcome, is that somebody graduates from a professional program and they are able to engage in autonomous practice effectively, and that they don't experience the same kind of transition of practice challenges that maybe we had in years past. To be fair, all health professions have transition of practice problems. We just think we're special. We're not. So ideally, somebody's prepared for autonomous practice upon graduation from a professional program. And then they have a bunch of different pathways. They could pursue a post-professional DAT. That might give them an opportunity to develop themselves as a practice leader and an advanced practice clinician. We still have the opportunity for folks to engage in post-professional master's programs. They might serve as a potential transition of practice experience. They might solidify their learning and kind of do some affirmation around some other professional preparation and give them an opportunity for more autonomous practice. We are seeing the emergence of certificates or micro-credentials that might also help somebody maybe enhance or have post-professional education in a niche area like behavioral health or emergency care. And then we've got the post-professional, like a PhD. Now, that might require some years of experience so you can gather clinical practice experience, but it's also intended to prepare somebody who might be engaged in scholarship or research more heavily. We know that both the PhD and the DAT have served as routes to prepare potential faculty, and some might be in a clinical faculty role, and some might be in a kind of research faculty role. And depending on the kind of PhD, it might prepare you best for administration. So like program administration, so degree programs in curriculum instruction, in leadership or curriculum. They might be really helpful. Higher education, they might be really helpful in preparing you to be a program director. And then you've got the residency and fellowship space. And so a resident is somebody who is learning in a residency program. They are developing themselves both through didactic education and mentored clinical practice. And they're developing themselves in a focused area of practice or a specialty area. So orthopedics is our most common area. And then we just had the first fellowship program in the country get ATC accredited, and that is in neurology. And so the intention of a fellowship program is a subspecialty area. So it would be, if you think about it from the perfect marriage of two specialties, orthopedics and pediatrics, somebody might become a fellow in pediatric orthopedics. So bringing those two kinds of things together. And then what's their role in actual athletic training practice is really interesting. So we've talked a little bit about DAT, PhD, and can potentially lead to faculty. DAT, the intention is clinical practice leadership. So the idea is that they're able to actually lead folks and understand personnel and how to lead and influence the system. And so that might be an ideal role for somebody with a DAT. You've also got niche areas in all of those programs. And so that might lead to kind of some focus based on the different DAT programs. And then in terms of how a professional program might train you, I try to describe this as that's essentially training a generalist. And then some of the DAT programs with a high focus on clinical practice might make somebody an advanced generalist. So kind of a generalist has breadth, right? So that's that professional program graduate. The DATs might give you a little bit more depth, so advanced generalist, where a specialty might dig deeper on one particular area, and then the fellowship even deeper. So when I think about an ideal practice system, and so college and university comes to mind, I might have somebody with a DAT credential in a leadership or associate or director position. Then I might have a resident, somebody who's a graduate from a resident or fellowship program, a specialist or a subspecialist. They might serve my system by, say, for instance, I'm an advanced generalist, and my primary patient panel is baseball, and I have experience with baseball, experience with my patient panel, but I have a patient who is not progressing after a Tommy John surgical intervention. And so the traditional approach isn't working. So then I might go to my colleague who's a specialist in orthopedics and say, let's work through and think about a care plan that might be more appropriate for this patient who's not progressing. So I might be able to tap into the specialty of those folks to help enhance my patient care. So I can do that through consultation, or I could refer my patient to that person and they might have individual meeting or appointments with that specialist while I'm also still caring for the entire patient panel and that whole baseball team. So
Gotcha.
There's different ways folks with this kind of training can truly impact how we deliver patient care and how to create an ideal group of people to serve our patients.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yep.
I'd much rather work with other athletic trainers anyway. So with the changes in requirements from going from bachelor's to a master's, mirroring other allied healthcare professionals, should we start having a recertification exam instead of CEUs?
That's a really good question, and I am going to have a very unpopular answer. So a lot of the research around the recertifying exams is not largely effective. So there are other healthcare professions that choose to do recertifying exams, and they've actually moved. Some folks had that plan, and then now they're moving away from it.
Mm-hmm.
The BOC has proposed essentially the continuing professional development or continuing professional competence, and it was very unpopular with the athletic training community. However, it is absolutely a doable system that truly taps into what in my practice am I not very good at? I need to go out and get continuing professional development or CEUs to fill that gap. Mm-hmm. Then I should actually figure out how that information is impacting my practice. And that's what quality improvement is. And I think folks are really turned off by the idea. I mean, we saw things like, this is research. I already did a thesis. I don't need to do that. But the reality is that's a total misconception of what quality improvement is. And if folks really think that, that makes me nervous that they aren't engaged in quality improvement in their own practice. And we should all be evaluating our practice to make sure that our patients are getting the best that they can from us. And so to me, it's basically learning QI or continuing professional development QI, where I identify what my deficit is. I go out and fill that hole. And then I figure out whether the information I gathered is actually improving my patient outcomes. And it makes a lot of actual sense when you deconstruct it from the idea of research project, or you're turned off by the phrasing around quality improvement, which I can't quite comprehend why that's so triggering for folks. But
yeah. Well, I think I put some articles in our show notes of, we've done research on this in our profession already, and we are very bad at picking out what we actually need to work on. We're only thinking about the day-to-day, and, I'm a big advocate for Domain 5, and I don't think people understand what fully goes into that. So how would people know to fix that kind of thing? Yeah. So it's very interesting that you brought that up, because I like doing CEUs. I don't want to do a recertification test, but at the same time, I feel kind of selfish sometimes on what I pick, because it's like, well, this sounds super fun and cool, but is it really helping me become a better clinician ultimately?
Yeah. There's a couple of different ways that I think we could do this effectively. Right now, the CPC plan includes self-assessment. And like you said, a lot of the research that I know that my team has done has identified that we're really bad at identifying what we know, what we don't know. Psychological research says that we overestimate what we think we know all the time. The Dunning-Kruger effect speaks to all of us. Mm-hmm. And so, maybe there is a mechanism to test our knowledge without there being negative consequences for how we perform that would identify areas where we need to elevate our knowledge, skills, and abilities. And the responsibility is not about failure or not failure on an exam, but about filling that gap. And that's what your professional responsibility is going in and learning about these things, because those are the things that will help your patient care.
Yeah. Could the evaluation be that your certification doesn't teeter on whether you do good or bad or on it. It's just an evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a mechanism to do that, right? Like, I think the thing is like, if you don't have a lot of faith in the system, you might feel really anxious about taking an exam and it not having consequences.
Yeah.
But I think if the system is set up to be improvement focused, and the system is set up to reward people who are actively engaged in making themselves better providers, then we can absolutely have a system that raises each other up by acknowledging the things that we're not great at and then filling in those gaps. I think you're 100% right. If you go to NATA, people go to the things that they're interested in. All of our research around continuing education has focused on why do people go to the things they go to, and it has a lot to do with clinical relevance, and it has a lot to do with interest.
Yeah.
But the reality is if a convention planning committee actually had data around what our deficits were, we might have programming that's less about what's interesting to you and more about what you actually need to learn and grow in.
Yeah, definitely. So as we were talking about the bachelor programs and how, or your program and how you were capped at how many credits you could offer so you could bring people in, do you feel like there's a little bit of a hole in between the recruitment of athletic training candidates from a high school to a master's program now that the bachelor's programs have disappeared?
I think there's a recruitment gap in everywhere.
Okay.
So as a person who is like spending a lot of time in the higher ed administration space, the decrease in number of students going to college, period, is challenging. So like I said, we're experiencing the impact of degree transition, the enrollment cliff, and then I think that the devaluing of athletic trainers during the pandemic, because if somebody saw, for instance, in the last 6 years, they saw that their athletic trainer was fired or laid off during the pandemic because they were seen as non-essential, would you choose that career when you were going to college? Probably not.
No job security.
Right. And so I also think that folks who are in college, specifically college athletes, we thought that the move to the master's degree was going to increase the likelihood that we would secure more student athletes in our master's programs. And I think that it probably has seen an uptick, although nobody, as far as I know, is measuring that.
Yeah.
What we haven't considered is that specifically the college and university setting has been the slowest to adapt to the changing market around athletic training. And the NCAA and the NATA, the Strategic Alliance, have come out and said that colleges need to do a better job of compensating athletic trainers and creating boundaries in the workplace that result in long-term professional commitment. And I think every one of us has seen poor salaries and people not actually delivering at that college university level, because there is a fundamental difference between a college president who is part of the NCAA conversation and who might be engaged in NCAA advocacy, and the HR person who's putting in the salary and the job description for the athletic trainer. Those two things are not talking to each other, because the athletic trainer salary is not going up. And when you see things like policy and procedure handbooks that indicate an athletic trainer needs to be available 24/7, absolutely not. Explain to me what a college student athlete needs from me at midnight. That's just foolishness. And if they are experiencing a stomachache or concussion or those kinds of things, that's what emergency medicine is for.
That's what your RA on campus is supposed to help you with.
Exactly. But college athletics is a business, and we have failed to make sure that the infrastructure matches the business side of college athletics. And that's where I think athletic trainers have gotten caught right in the middle of that. Same with coaches. many of the second and third tier coaches. So maybe not head coaches, but definitely assistants, graduate assistants. They're all caught in this poorly compensated 24/7, 365 model of sport in America. And the business side has not elevated the infrastructure to match the needs of the patients.
Yes. Yeah, I think the COVID situation should have, boomed the athletic training profession. I still can't believe that we don't get credit that we were on the front lines creating policies and procedures for the institutions. We were all the guinea pigs, basically, and we're still not getting any credit for that. So shout out to all the other athletic trainers that had to make policies and deal with everything with nobody else on campus. You guys are awesome.
Yep, absolutely.
But that would have been a pivotal moment for how much risk we were putting into our job at that point. And I think we should have negotiated higher salaries for what we had to go through. And nobody took that as the chance to break through on their compensation, which I think is crazy.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how to recruit, keep, and prepare potential AT students that are interested but might get lost in that bachelor's limbo?
I mean, I think the place where we have to fix the profession is in the employment. Okay. I think that if we cannot convince human resources and the people that put money behind the mission of organizations, if we cannot convince them of our value, then it doesn't matter how many people we bring in. I mean, athletic trainers are leaving the profession within the first 10 years. So we can't match the need by only bringing in new athletic trainers. We have to make the profession attractive enough for people to continue to be an athletic trainer. And some of that is compensation, but some of that is also ensuring that the work structure is not exploitative of human beings, because we do that all the time. We have the number of athletic trainers who I consider myself older. But I can't tell you the number of athletic trainers who said, well, you just don't get a sick day. That's not the American labor system does not account for that. That's not reality. You absolutely, the pandemic should have taught us that if we're sick, we shouldn't be bringing that sickness to work.
Yeah.
And we still have folks selling that message, teaching that through preceptorship, which I think is also a propagating effect in our profession. And so folks still look at this as if they are not permitted boundaries and they can't have full lives and make life choices that allow them to keep their profession and have their personal life. And we have made it inhospitable to be an athletic trainer who is in their midlife. Yeah. And so some of that is about solving the problem at the employer. And that's going to be what makes it more attractive for people as they're progressing and seeing folks in those positions. If we think about it from a public health perspective, the need for athletic training is so dumb obvious. It baffles me how we haven't figured out how to sell that message from a public health perspective. Mm-hmm. But because we've got poor compensation and poor infrastructure to do the work, people aren't attracted, and thus we are hitting a point where we have too many positions to fill and nobody's taking those jobs. And some of it is that the jobs are so bad that nobody should take them. Mm-hmm. And some of it is that we simply don't have enough personnel to meet that need.
Yeah.
But I think we should be telling everybody about athletic training. Some of the conversations I have with other educators are starting the conversation as early as middle school, making sure that folks see athletic trainers in practice. How many times have you heard, I became an athletic trainer because I tore my ACL, and then I went to a physical therapist and I had this really great interaction with them. And then I learned that athletic training was a thing, that I didn't have to be in an office all day. And I was really excited about that.
Yeah.
The part where physical therapist runs off the tongue of so many people in the sport area that had never met an athletic trainer until they got into college and saw some of those folks in practice, or, folks seeing athletic trainers on TV. And so that helps with spreading the message about what athletic trainers can do. But we also aren't spreading the broader message that we're one of the only professions that has 9 to 900 different places one could work. So what I get excited about in clinical practice, there's probably a space for me somewhere. So if I like, airplanes, there's a decent chance there's a job out there where an athletic trainer is working with people in airlines, right? Similarly, if I like industrial work, or I like military work, or I don't necessarily love sports, but I like the idea of being a person of contact around orthopedics and workplace health and wellness. Like, that's something we need to be letting the world know exists. And we should be doing that a lot earlier. I think right now we just recruit through chance. And that's how lots of folks did it when we were in bachelor's degree programs. We're not stupid. Athletic training's at the top of the alphabet. When you click degree programs, students see that and they get really excited about it. And now we don't have that luxury as the way to kind of bring them in. And so we were getting a lot of folks by chance, and too many folks have been slow to adapt to figure out what is our focused recruitment plan and how early, how regularly do I need to be making contact with folks to actually yield a student in your program. Yeah. And you want to make sure that you're getting them to a program that will actually help them meet their goals, their professional goals.
Yeah, definitely. So going back to the comment about us being available 24/7, where do you think that rooted from? Was that trying to create job security, a codependency, trying to be involved with the team?
I think that some of the origins of athletic training being in college athletics, and then the codependency between athletic training and college athletics has led to, I think about coaches perceive themselves as needing to be available 24/7. If a student athlete gets in trouble and is arrested in the middle of the night, a coach is often
has to deal with it.
The reality is those are grown people, and if we didn't have the infrastructure that, if we didn't have coaches to do that part of the job, that is a grown adult who has to manage that situation all by themselves.
Yeah.
And, I think it's that rootedness in college athletics, but I also think that you're not wrong. There's a false connection between altruism, which is the desire to help others, and availability. So there's a difference between accessibility and availability from my perspective. Like, accessible needs to be within reason, creating a space of inclusion, those kinds of things. But availability is an infringement on my life as a person in the American labor system. And I think all of America is saying that, right? Like, capitalism exploits the worker, and we're simply caught in that in a different context. But the subculture of sport in America exacerbates the need for us to be available to these folks.
Yeah. Well, looking at the relationship between Katie and the AT programs, I know that Katie doesn't oversee the doctorate levels, but how does that relationship actually work? I know that they have to come in and audit and make sure you're checking all the boxes, but is it a more integrated relationship than what we see as students or outside athletic trainers that aren't working in the educational system?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm going to try to take off my, I volunteer for the Katie perspective, because I'm not speaking for the Katie. I will put on the hat of, I've been a program director, and I've had 3 different site visits as a program administrator. So the relationship between the CAT and programs is that the CAT helps to establish what the kind of minimum expectations are to create a safe place for learning.
Okay.
And then beyond that, at the professional level, give us context as to what we should be teaching, the curricular content standards.
Mm-hmm.
When I was facilitating a bachelor's degree program, it wasn't with this particular set of standards, but I've done some educational consulting around this set of standards. So I feel like I have a pretty good picture of what that looks like. The intention is that that creates the kind of guardrails for me to deliver a program, and then I get to have the freedom and the latitude to bring my faculty together and say, okay, these are the guardrails. How do we envision a program that can deliver on those expectations, but be different, be attractive to our kind of key audience? And so I don't particularly find the standards confining, but I think and I was trained in curriculum instruction, and I think that is one of my advantages. So I think some folks feel like the standards are intended to tell you what you can't do. And I try to look at it from the perspective of these are guardrails about what I can do, and then I can have creativity within that to explore different ways to deliver my program that fall within these guardrails, but at the same time can result in a better result than my peers, because that's how I'm going to recruit students, right? Is to say, I've got a better result. And I think that one of the things that folks have to do differently in terms of creating professional programs is that we need to stop thinking that the BOC exam is the outcome.
Yep.
I want to create clinicians that are operating at the top of their license, and that far exceeds the BOC exam. Mm-hmm. So I should be creating a program in those guardrails to do good work. When we undergo the comprehensive review process, we basically write about our program relative to those standards, and then have other people, external reviewers, come in and look at our program. And those external reviewers are trained and developed to understand what the expectations are, the standards, and then understand how to kind of facilitate that review process. And so they typically come to your physical site and they learn on site about how you deliver your program. And much of what they're trying to do is triangulate the data. So I'm telling them what I'm doing through the self-study. I should be using a lot more we's because I don't do it independently, right? We do it as a faculty. But we prepare the material and we invite those folks to come and we share what we do. And they're corroborating what I said we were doing in the self-study with what they're seeing on the ground. And that includes interviews with students and other faculty and administrators and preceptors, and kind of affirming what we've communicated. And so there's a bunch of different outcomes that can happen, right? They can suggest that we need to make some changes and that we might not have sufficient evidence to say that we're meeting a standard. And that can lead to kind of a progress report or that kind of cycle of quality improvement that we were talking about as an independent clinician and doing continuing professional development. The same kind of QI process is happening when we do the comprehensive review. My self-study is really just me telling you like what our plan is and how we execute. And then we get this kind of external feedback, and that helps us start that quality improvement process again. And so I've done that for our professional bachelor's program, for our post-professional master's program when we had one. And then the CAT actually does accredit post-professional DATs. We're the only accredited DAT in the country. Okay. And so that will end in 2026. So their accrediting of programs will end in 2026.
Okay. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
Well, when looking at the program development, obviously you get to pick or choose what you incorporate in as long as it is in those guidelines. Is there a course that you would love to push into your curriculum, even though it's jam-packed already, that you think would help the profession?
I think it's not that I would specifically curate a course, but I think how we think about teaching needs to better match patient care. I think sometimes we still use siloed classes like emergency care and diagnosis and rehab. And what we fail to do is actually replicate what it's like when a patient first walks into the space and how we interact with them. So if I was conceptualizing the ideal curriculum, I'd actually teach admin first. I know that's like super crazy, but it would teach me about the legal and safety aspects I should be thinking before I even open a door to a patient, right?
Yes.
So I think about it from the perspective of, I need a facility that's safe to do the job that I need to do. So I might teach those administrative concepts earlier in the process so that I understand what are the constraints around which I should be practicing as an athletic trainer. And then thinking about curriculum that speaks to that first encounter or interaction with a patient, which might include things like PPEs and preventative strategies before I see even a patient who's injured. So thinking about curating a curriculum that actually thinks about the life cycle of the athletic trainer in context of interacting with the patient, and then making sure I have an integrated curriculum where it doesn't feel like I'm taking this one class and then this one class. Because if you're going to engage in concurrent clinical education, which most athletic training programs do, where you're doing didactic work and clinical at the same time at some points, and we do see obviously immersive experiences at various points in different curricula, but most programs are still doing a degree of concurrent clinical education. You would never want a learner to get to the space where they're interacting with a patient and they're like, I know what it is, but I can't do anything about it because I don't know how to treat it, because I don't know any of that. And so I wish we thought about curriculum in that particular way.
Yeah, a more systematic approach.
I think it would be easier for the learner to integrate themselves into clinical education, and they'd be far more likely to have progressive autonomy because they've thought about how do I interact with the patient and help them progress in their care so that I could then progress in my making decisions around particular conditions as they progress through the program.
No, that totally makes more sense.
Yeah.
So with that progression that you wish would happen, the hands-on approach and, the BOC not being, that's the minimum evaluation basically is what you said. So why did we get rid of the practical portion of the BOC since we are a hands-on profession? It seems a little weird that we are just testing off book knowledge basically. Can you give any insight on that?
So I can only speak to this from I'm hypothesizing because I don't actually have any data as to why, but I would imagine that was a business decision, that financially it was difficult for the BOC to create those spaces to deliver the practical exams. And from an accessibility perspective, you have to travel a certain distance to go take the exam. So is that an accessibility issue for test takers? I think that's, although I'm not really sure we were considering that in 2003, it's possible. But I think the reality is there is an expectation and relationship between CAT accredited programs and taking the exam. The expectation is that the program has done its due diligence to make sure that you are practically prepared and that you are experiencing progressively autonomous clinical practice experiences so that by the time you're eligible to take the exam, there's evidence that you can make independent decisions that aren't going to harm people. And so that the program is doing its job to prepare people to do that. The problem is when programs are thinking about their job is to prepare people to take the exam. That's where the disconnect is. The purpose of the program is to prepare autonomous clinicians that can also pass this exam.
Yes.
But the same kinds of concepts happened to America when we decided to do No Child Left Behind and a testing culture in K through 12 education, right? We stopped teaching people to be citizens of the world and thinkers and problem solvers because there was an expectation that they pass this exam so that they could progress in the educational system. And then we actually created punishment for schools when you couldn't have or weren't successful at those exams. And so then you've got a bunch of people trying to save their own jobs, right? You got to think about it from a survivalist perspective as a teacher. If I can't help the student pass the exam, then I might lose my job. So now I'm just going to teach to the exam so that they can pass the exam so that I can keep my job, even if I haven't taught them to be a really good thinker in the world.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when folks are solely reliant on the exam. And I think that, like I said before, the CAT essentially establishes the guardrails.
Yep.
For me, as a program director, I absolutely have the autonomy to say that the expectation of my program is that a student meets this threshold on something like the AT milestones, or I can feel competent they're demonstrating, or I can feel confident they are demonstrating competence in the domains of clinical practice, and I'm measuring that through valid measures that aren't the exam.
Yeah.
But I think too many of us rely on the exam as the metric of competence. And like I said, it's minimal competence. And so I have a responsibility to do better for their future patients by ensuring that they can make autonomous decisions through the curriculum that I've created, and creating stop points and remediation points to say, you're not ready to progress. So how do we fill in this gap? And that's one of the harder parts to do in formal higher education. If you don't have an institution that embraces the federal definition of competency-based education, it's really hard to stop somebody from progressing if they're getting sufficient GPA, but not demonstrating the knowledge, skills, and abilities to progress. And so when somebody comes up with the perfect curricular plan that fits in formal education, that talks about progression of competence, I'll let you know when I find that perfect program.
So do you think that they should get rid of posting the pass rate of programs? Do you think that's kind of misleading?
So that's actually, there's a couple things there, right? So the CAT actually in the last several years has vacated the standards around a minimum threshold. So the passing rate threshold, those standards have been vacated. And there's some literature that suggests that the BOC exam marginalizes marginalized populations. And so there's evidence to support specifically that decision, especially when we've been talking about trying to diversify our community of athletic trainers for decades. But I don't think that they should not report the pass rate, because both the CAT and the BOC have a responsibility to the public. So I have a responsibility as a program to make sure I'm doing better than the BOC exam. But I also don't want to create a bunch of really great clinicians who can't pass the exam, because then they cannot enter into the profession. So it's the nuance of having data around, publicly reported data around the success on the BOC exam, but I should be reporting all the other successful things that we're doing too, which might include placement rate, employer effectiveness, or employer survey data. It might also be about talking about the ways in which we assess learners. So talking about the fact that we use something like the AT milestones, or something like using a competence model that can say like 100% of students who graduate from our program demonstrate competence in domain 2, and 100% of, right? So there are ways in which I, as a program, can do better in publicly telling somebody how we're elevating the learner. And it doesn't, and the CAT is never saying you can't also report other data. They're simply saying, from a public safety perspective, they don't want students investing in higher education and graduate level higher education and then not being eligible to become a professional because the program isn't successful at helping students pass. And so it's both of those things are really important.
I was just trying to figure out how to get around that stigma that there are some programs that are just teaching to the test if those numbers are so important. Like, they obviously want to meet that 100%, but at the same time, are they doing it backwards in that, just teaching to the test, as we had mentioned before? So that's where I was trying to figure out, how do we show that the student is prepared to enter the world? So I wasn't sure if you had any other ways to measure that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the consumer needs to be a better consumer. Like, I think a lot of times we go to college around geography. Today's learner is so different. I think different colleges offer different opportunities and can highlight their kind of niche area, and they should be selling that. Yep. Consumers should be looking for programs that are communicating how they're effectively passing the certifying exam, but they also should be asking, like, how are you making me better than somebody else who's entering the profession at the same exact time? And exactly. I should have a really good answer to that. That's not just 100% pass rate.
Yeah. We'll look into the future. What do you think the next steps are for the master's programs?
I think we're going to see a little bit more shrinking, but I also think we might see the emergence of larger programs at some larger institutions that are more comfortable with some of these healthcare professions education programs. So we might see a little bit more fluctuation in the total number of programs. I think we'd all like to see more interested students in those programs. I'd like to see more students interested in post-professional education and having more familiarity with what their options are upon graduation. Yeah. And I don't think it has to be immediate. I'd love for folks not to, we as a culture want things now. I mean, I think that's just part of who we are. And sometimes we're not ready to learn how to be a leader, or we're not ready to learn how to be a specialist. We need some more comfort with having time and practice and basically learning our own clinical philosophy and who we are as a person and a provider before we add on responsibilities like leadership or specialization. Mm-hmm. And in the perfect world, that means that those programs are also full, but not able to capture learners who are ready to move into those kind of advanced practice spaces.
The maturity level ish.
It's academic and emotional maturity. I don't think it's chronological maturity, because I think I've met plenty of 18-year-olds that blow my mind in terms of commitment and responsibility and sense of self and empathy. So I don't think it's always chronological. But I do think we need academic maturity. Like, somebody in a post-professional program shouldn't be out to get an A or a grade. They should be there to learn and to grow. And that's not something I think we've figured out how to sell, again, in American culture, not just in
Yeah. Do you feel that we're going to move to a requirement of a doctorate at some point?
I really don't. I really don't. I don't think that the American healthcare education system could tolerate that much more degree elevation with the broader conversation around debt and the value of higher ed.
Yeah.
Especially when our international peers are not seeing degree elevation in the same way.
Yeah. What trends are you excited about in athletic training currently?
I am excited that more of these conversations are happening out in the open and are not necessarily in closed door spaces, primarily facilitated by white men.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting how people are coming out and speaking more about the problems that we're experiencing. I think that's the only way we're going to grow, if we actually have conversations, real conversations.
Yeah, we have to start thinking about what are solutions. And I wish we were more solution-oriented culture.
Yeah. And if you could define athletic training in 3 words, what would you say?
I'm going to cheat. Good humans. I think altruistic, so really wanting to help people.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my vision word verse is I wish we were more adaptable, but I think we have the capacity for adapting in different environments. And we're at one of those inflection points in our profession. And if we fail to adapt, or we fail to help decision makers realize that we are adaptable, then I think we're going to struggle.
Yeah.
Continue to struggle.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's kind of all I had for you today. That was quite an intensive educational session.
Well, hopefully, your listeners will pick up something from what I said. I have been doing this for a little while, and I deeply care about the success of athletic training education, and I think there's so much value in innovative and creative educational programming that leads to strong healthcare providers, regardless of the discipline.
Yep.
And so I want more people to learn about how to be a really good educator in healthcare, so that some of these creative ideas don't seem so like outlandish or nobody's ever heard of them before. And I think we'd be better served by a really educated group, not just on athletic training, but on healthcare education.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Absolutely.
This was awesome and brought out a lot of information that I was hoping to bring out and show everybody else what's going on in athletic training.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem.
That's it for today's episode of To the Bone. I hope we've sparked some new thoughts, challenged your perspectives, or simply reminded you to dig a little deeper. Remember, life isn't just about what's on the surface. Sometimes you've got to cut deeper and get to the bone of what really matters. To the Bone podcast is a product of Daily LLC. It's hosted and produced by Shelby Daly, ATC, and Randy Daly. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can be present. For more on the show, visit www.tothebonepodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Get involved in the conversation. You can find us at www.tothebonepodcast.com. Drop us topic suggestions or be a potential guest. We're all about connecting with you, our listeners. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep cutting deep.